The concept of a prison where inmates are locked away for life is one that has been a subject of intense debate and scrutiny in the criminal justice system. One of the most infamous examples of such a prison is the ADX Florence in Colorado, which has been dubbed the Alcatraz of the Rockies. This facility is known for its extreme security measures, including solitary confinement, limited human interaction, and constant surveillance. The conditions in these prisons are often described as harsh, with inmates spending 23 hours a day in their cells, and the remaining hour in a small, enclosed outdoor space. These facilities, often referred to as maximum security prisons or superax prisons, are designed to house the most dangerous and high-risk offenders. The idea behind such institutions is to isolate these individuals from society permanently, ensuring that they can no longer pose a threat to the public. The history of life imprisonment dates back centuries, with the idea of locking away criminals for the remainder of their lives being seen as a more humane alternative to execution. However, the modern concept of life without the possibility of parole, LWP, has evolved into a form of punishment that is, in many ways, more severe than the death penalty. In the United States, the use of LWP has increased significantly since the 1970s, particularly in cases involving violent crimes such as murder, rape, and terrorism. The rationale behind this shift is that it provides a sense of finality and justice for victims and their families, while also eliminating the risk of the offender ever being released back into society. However, critics argue that LWP is a form of living death, where inmates are condemned to spend the rest of their lives in a state of perpetual confinement, often in conditions that are psychologically damaging. The psychological impact of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole is one of the most contentious aspects of this form of punishment. Studies have shown that long-term solitary confinement, which is often a feature of life sentences in maximum security prisons, can lead to severe mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, hallucinations, and even suicidal tendencies. Inmates who are locked away for life are often deprived of meaningful human contact, which can exacerbate feelings of isolation and despair. For example, in ADX Florence, inmates are housed in single cells with solid steel doors, and communication with other prisoners is strictly prohibited. This level of isolation can lead to a phenomenon known as prison psychosis, where inmates lose touch with reality and experience a complete breakdown of their mental faculties. The legal and ethical implications of life imprisonment without parole have been the subject of much debate. Proponents argue that it is a necessary tool for protecting society from the most dangerous criminals, and that it provides a sense of closure for victims and their families. However, opponents contend that it is a violation of human rights, particularly when applied to juvenile offenders or individuals who have committed nonviolent crimes. The United Nations has criticized the use of life imprisonment without parole, stating that it can amount to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, especially when applied to young offenders. In recent years, there has been a growing movement to reform the use of LWP, with some states in the U.S. introducing legislation to allow for the possibility of parole after a certain number of years, particularly for juvenile offenders. The economic cost of life imprisonment is another factor that has come under scrutiny. Housing inmates for life is an expensive endeavor, with the cost of maintaining maximum security prisons running into the billions of dollars annually. In the United States, the average cost of incarcerating an inmate for life is estimated to be around $1 million, taking into account the cost of housing, health care, and security. This has led some to question whether the resources spent on life imprisonment could be better used for rehabilitation programs, education, and other forms of crime prevention. Critics argue that the current system prioritizes punishment over rehabilitation, and that investing in programs that address the root causes of crime could be more effective in reducing recidivism and improving public safety. The use of life imprisonment without parole varies widely across different countries and legal systems. In some countries, such as Norway and Sweden, life sentences are rare, and even when they are imposed, there is usually the possibility of parole after a certain period of time. In contrast, the United States has one of the highest rates of life imprisonment in the world, with over 50,000 inmates currently serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. This disparity reflects different cultural attitudes towards crime and punishment, with some countries placing a greater emphasis on rehabilitation and reintegration, while others prioritize retribution and deterrence. The global trend, however, appears to be moving towards a more balanced approach, with an increasing number of countries recognizing the need for reform in their criminal justice systems. The role of race and socioeconomic status in the imposition of life sentences is another area of concern. Studies have shown that African Americans and other minority groups are disproportionately represented among those serving life sentences without parole. This disparity is often attributed to systemic racism within the criminal justice system, including biased policing, harsher sentencing for minority defendants, and a lack of access to quality legal representation. For example, a report by the Sentencing Project found that African Americans are more likely to receive life sentences for nonviolent offenses, such as drug crimes, compared to their white counterparts. This has led to calls for greater transparency and accountability in the sentencing process, as well as reforms to address the underlying racial and economic inequalities that contribute to these disparities. The impact of life imprisonment on families and communities is often overlooked in discussions about the criminal justice system. When an individual is sentenced to life without parole, it not only affects the inmate but also their loved ones, who may struggle with feelings of loss, guilt, and stigma. Children of incarcerated parents, in particular, are at a higher risk of experiencing emotional and psychological difficulties, as well as economic hardship. The ripple effects of life imprisonment can extend beyond the immediate family, affecting entire communities, especially in areas where a significant portion of the population is incarcerated. This has led to calls for more support services for families affected by incarceration, as well as policies that promote family reunification and community reintegration. The use of life imprisonment for nonviolent offenses has been a particularly controversial issue. In some cases, individuals have been sentenced to life without parole for crimes such as drug possession, theft, or even repeat offenses of relatively minor crimes under three-strikes laws. Critics argue that such sentences are disproportionate to the crimes committed and that they contribute to the overcrowding of prisons. For example, in the case of Leandro Andrade, a father of three, was sentenced to life without parole for stealing $153 worth of videotapes under California's three-strikes law. This case sparked outrage and led to a broader discussion about the need for sentencing reform, particularly in cases where the punishment does not fit the crime. The role of the judiciary in imposing life sentences without parole is another area of concern. Judges are often given significant discretion in sentencing, which can lead to inconsistencies and disparities in how life sentences are applied. In some cases, judges may be influenced by public opinion, political pressure, or personal biases, leading to harsher sentences for certain defendants. This has led to calls for more standardized sentencing guidelines, as well as greater oversight and accountability in the judicial process. Some advocates have also called for the abolition of mandatory minimum sentences, which require judges to impose a life sentence for certain crimes, regardless of the individual circumstances of the case. The impact of life imprisonment on the mental health of inmates is a growing concern, particularly in light of the increasing use of solitary confinement. Inmates who are locked away for life often experience a sense of hopelessness and despair, which can lead to severe mental health issues. Studies have shown that long-term isolation can cause cognitive decline, memory loss, and even psychosis. In some cases, inmates have been known to engage in self-harm or suicide as a result of the extreme conditions of their confinement. This has led to calls for greater mental health support for inmates serving life sentences, as well as reforms to reduce the use of solitary confinement, particularly for those who are already vulnerable due to pre-existing mental health conditions. The use of life imprisonment for juvenile offenders has been a particularly contentious issue, both in the United States and internationally. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles are unconstitutional, stating that such sentences violate the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. This decision has led to a re-evaluation of life sentences for juvenile offenders, with many states now allowing for the possibility of parole after a certain number of years.